Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eickhoff, and I'm the Director of Alumni Operations at John Carroll University. Thank you again for joining us for this session of A.C.E.S, the Alumni Continuing Education Series. A.C.E.S was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The program offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of members of our John Carroll University administration, faculty, and alumni community. Over the past year, we've heard from experts on ethics and leadership, racial equity and social justice, disruptive technology, Ignatian spirituality, the war in Ukraine, and youth sports, just to name a few. Today, we will explore American history, specifically the life of Alexander Hamilton and the man behind the myth. Before I introduce our featured guest, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to view the program in full screen mode. Additionally, please ensure that you stay muted throughout the duration of the program. Following the program, we'll have an opportunity for questions. Please utilize the chat feature for your questions, and I will ask them to our guest. It is now my honor to introduce our featured presenter for tonight's program. Dr. Marcus Gallo has taught courses in American and world history at John Carroll since 2014. He received his PhD in American history from the University of California, Davis. His research focused on land speculation and political corruption in the early modern world. He is currently co-authoring a biography on George Croghan, a British diplomat and a long-distance trader whose efforts in the Ohio Valley hastened the French and Indian War, ultimately leading to the American Revolution. Dr. Gallo, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so glad to have you. The floor is yours.
Okay. All right. I hope everybody can see that. So I'm going to be talking about Hamilton today. And as you probably know, Hamilton the musical is going to be playing pretty soon here in Playhouse Square in Cleveland. So I figured I would just give a little bit of background on the play itself. So it was written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and it was written in the aftermath of the success that he had performing in the Heights. And he was casting around looking for his next project. He found a biography of Lincoln that he liked, Team of Rivals, but he soon found out that Spielberg had already optioned it, and he figured that there would be licensing issues there. He better find a new project. And he found a biography of Hamilton, I believe at a Borders, Ron Chernow's biography. Really liked it, saw this character as an essential sort of hip hop hero, and then started composing that musical over the course of 7 years. It started on off-Broadway in 2015, rocketed pretty quickly to Broadway, began U.S. tours, Disney Plus, and won a bunch of Tonys, won a Pulitzer Prize for drama, and is continuing, and basically is a cultural sensation, not just in the U.S., but around the world. It's starting to be being translated into other languages. I know at least that it's been translated into German, and they're performing over there. In America, there's been a cultural impact. Arguably, Hamilton has been a fairly famous figure for a long time. But by the early 2000s, he was not quite as famous as he had once been. And that's somewhat indicated by the Treasury Department thinking that they were going to replace Hamilton on the $10 bill. So at the beginning of 2015, they announced that Hamilton was likely to be replaced by an unnamed woman, probably Harriet Tubman. And then 2015 was also when the play Hamilton came out and came onto Broadway. Fairly quickly after that, probably in some relation to the fame that's come about because of the play, the Treasury Department changed its mind and decided to put Harriet Tubman on the 20, replacing Andrew Jackson instead. So there really has been a surge of interest in Hamilton the person because of Hamilton the musical. So I want to talk a little bit about Hamilton the person so that we get a sense, a brief overview of his life and what he was really about. So the thing that I want to emphasize is that Hamilton's life can kind of be seen as a quest for glory or a quest for honor. He had very humble beginnings. We'll talk about that in a moment here, but was really, really massively talented, had huge drive and ambition, and wanted to overcome those humble beginnings to make something of himself. And the opportunity that he had was the American Revolution. So this was a very fluid time, a time in which someone could rise through the ranks very, very rapidly. And ultimately, he made a huge impact on the new country. So the biggest impact that he made as a founder was shaping the new country, the Constitution that formed the modern United States, but also shaping the first presidency. He was the main policy figure in Washington's cabinet. And it's from there that the origins of the current really powerful fiscal military state, that those origins arose. And in addition to that, it was Hamilton's conflict with Jefferson that really started the modern political divide. And you can more or less trace the current parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, back to the original divide between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. So in terms of what his policies were, he was really interested in turning America into a great power. And he was convinced that in order for America to be able to win wars in the future, that it had to tie together the state and elites, the financial elites of especially cities. So one would look at that and say, well, okay, is this really about America? Is it really about the power of the country? Or was Hamilton just self-seeking? Did he want to attach himself to wealthy people so that he could make money for himself? Ultimately, if you look at how Hamilton's life turns out, he dies pretty poor. And in fact, he dies more or less politically disgraced. If he was only in this for the money, he did not do a very good job of making decisions in his life. I think instead, what you can really see is a focus on politics, a focus on status, a focus on his own personal honor. And the attachment that he had to the American state and trying to make it as powerful as possible and something that could win wars against great powers. That's really the key to understanding Hamilton. So in terms of his family background, his mother was of British and Huguenot descent, so French Protestants. His grandparents lived in Nevis, which was at that time controlled by the British. His grandfather was a physician, but his grandparents divorced, and Rachel Fawcett, his mother, left with her mother to another island, St. Croix, that was controlled by Danes. And there in St. Croix, Alexander's grandmother more or less forced Rachel to marry John Michael Levine, who was a local merchant, on the understanding that Levine was well-to-do. But this was more of a mirage. Levine really struggled financially. The marriage did not work well, so Rachel and Levine had a son, Peter, but she was also imprisoned for indecency, probably at Levine's behest, and got out of there as quickly as possible. As soon as she got out of prison, she left the island, went back to Nevis. And then at Nevis, that's where she met Alexander's father, James Hamilton. Now, James Hamilton, in some ways, was pretty similar to Levine, although he came from real money. His family was one of the wealthiest families in Scotland, but it was a noble family, and they had this institution of primogeniture. All of the wealth, all of the land is going to go to the first son, and James Hamilton was the fourth son. So he had to make his own way in the world. And he ended up going to the Caribbean, becoming a merchant, but really not doing well, not handling his funds well, getting into things like gambling and kind of drifting around. So Rachel had sort of found two similar figures in succession, but her marriage, or quote unquote marriage with Hamilton, was a little bit more stable. So she cohabited with him for 15 years. They had two sons. Alexander was the second son. And all of that time, or at least for most of that time, she was still technically married to Levine. Now, Rachel did receive a divorce in 1759 and then remarried and married James. But by 1765, they had realized or were made aware that the terms of the divorce did not allow for remarriage. So technically, at that point, James Hamilton was in an illegal bigamous marriage that he could be prosecuted for. So James essentially arranged to have a business trip to get himself off the island, went to St. Kitts, and then essentially disappeared in 1765 and did not come back to the family. So at that point, Alexander is probably 10. It's possible that he was 8, so he claimed to have been born in 1757. It's likely that he fabricated that in order to make himself more attractive as a potential apprentice, or at least appear to be more precocious than he was. In any event, he's still very young, and he's living with his mother on their own. And he's in St. Croix, where she has left to try to make a life on her own, and really a social outcast. So he's a bastard. He's not received communion. He can't go to the local Christian schools, and he ends up with his schooling at a local Jewish school. And some people have speculated, there's especially a more recent biographer that speculated that this means that Levine, the original husband, was Jewish, was a Jewish merchant, and that Rachel had converted to Judaism, which would allow Alexander to attend these schools. It's really not clear that is the case. It's possible, but not something that was part of his reputation later in life. So ultimately, many things about his personal background would be attacked. He was attacked for being a bastard. He was accused of being of mixed heritage, partially Black. He was never accused of being Jewish. So it's probably on balance of evidence unlikely that that was true. However, he was definitely trained in Hebrew as a young man and had memorized parts of the Torah, etc. So he's an outcast in St. Croix, not really integrated as part of the community. And Rachel is having to shift on her own. So she's having to sell things out of the store that she makes. And basically, she attaches Alexander to a wholesaler, a couple of wholesalers from New York City, Beckman and Kruger, that are trying to, again, run a merchant's establishment here in the Caribbean. The problems compound for Alexander. So Rachel dies in 1768. So at this point, Alexander is probably 13 years old. And at that point, she only has one legitimate son, Peter, and Peter claims her estate. So Alexander cannot continue living where he lived. And Alexander and James are put into the family of one of Rachel's nephews, so that nephew can take care of them. That nephew very quickly commits suicide. And at that point, James is old enough to apprentice himself off as a carpenter's apprentice. Alexander is really not, and basically is forced to live with a friend while he continues working for Kruger and Beckman. And it's at this point that he really doubles down on his personal education. He's very much self-taught. He becomes a voracious reader, and he's going to do everything that he can to get himself off of the island and to make something of himself. He starts really dreaming of war. You can see this in his letters to his friends, that if there were only a war, that he would be able to save himself and make something of himself. Excuse me. So he does have a couple of opportunities. Kruger leaves and basically leaves Alexander in charge of the store for a long part of a year. At that point, Alexander is doing things like giving instructions to smugglers for how they can avoid customs. He really becomes someone that can be relied upon to run things. And at the same time, I've got this quote here. I'll go ahead and read it. He's thinking of all the ways that he might get off the island. So he says, "My ambition is so prevalent that I condemn the groveling and condition of a clerk or the like, to which my fortune condemns me, and would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station." So this is a fairly typical attitude of Hamilton throughout his life, right? That the idea is that he wants to exalt his character, that he wants honor, and he's willing to risk his life in order to get it. He needs to get out of his current station. And this is an emphasis that you will see over and over again throughout the rest of his life. Now, the real opportunity comes, ironically, in the summer of 1772, when a hurricane blows through the Caribbean. He writes a very ornate essay describing the effects of this hurricane. A local minister reads this and begins to take a collection from merchants and other people to send him to be educated in college on the mainland. The idea was that he was going to be educated at Princeton. This was a local Presbyterian minister. They wanted to send him to a Presbyterian school. But ultimately, the problem for Alexander is that he wanted to get through that college education quickly. And this was not something that would be possible at Princeton because they tended to make money off of room and board and did not want anybody taking an accelerated series of classes to get through college. So in the long run, he does some prep school. He really struggled with math, but ends up at King's College, which is now Columbia, in order to get his education. So one of the interesting things that people noted about Hamilton was his work ethic, but also his ability to set things to memory. So through mnemonic devices, through saying things out loud, often pacing around, reading his notes until they were set in his mind. And if you look at some of the reports that he makes in the Washington administration, it's arguable that some of the facts that are in those reports were memorized 20 years earlier. So he really develops not exactly a photographic memory, but a very powerful memory that's developed through mnemonic devices. And this is one of the times that he's noticeable among his peers for developing these kinds of talents. Now, the other thing is that he's arriving in America right in the midst of the imperial crisis. So the imperial crisis was essentially a tax revolt. The French and Indian War had been extremely expensive. The British, who had earlier not really taxed the Americans, began to tax in a systematic way. And you have a lot of political protest over the propriety of these taxes. And Hamilton jumps right in and begins writing pamphlets. Throughout his life, he's a really consistent and voluminous writer of pamphlets, oftentimes anonymously. So this is really when he starts, and he's a very active patriot. So he's seeing the patriot cause as a real opportunity for him to make something out of himself. So as soon as it's possible to do so, he joins a volunteer militia. That volunteer militia moves to seize cannons from part of New York City. He uses his connections through the Patriot Network to raise an entire artillery company with even more cannons, and very quickly is elected captain of that company. So very, very fast. And as soon as the revolution starts to turn to war, Hamilton's star starts to rise. So he is part of a whole series of battles, especially in the early New York, New Jersey campaign early on in the war. A couple of things worth mentioning is that he really stood out in the rearguard action as Washington's army was withdrawing from New York City. So the rearguard was personally led by Hamilton with a couple of cannons. And then the other thing that's interesting is that he personally bombarded Nassau Hall at Princeton. So this college that he had wanted to attend but basically couldn't. It was controlled by British folks. His cannons were the ones that bombarded the hall until they surrendered. And even today, if you go on a tour of Princeton, you can see where the cannonballs made their impact. But Hamilton was maybe more or destined for more than just a command of artillery. He really liked being in the field. He liked the idea of having personal glory, but he was also someone that had a nose for status and a nose for hierarchy. And one of the things that's said about him is that he would often figure out ways to pitch his tent physically close to Washington's when the army would have an encampment. So that, combined with his personal bravery, made it very obvious that Washington would soon figure out who is this person, who is this talented person. So in time, Hamilton would be offered an aide-de-camp role from a number of generals, but consistently turned them down until Washington made that offer. And the basic idea was that At that time, during this early modern period, you didn't have extensive military staffs. Instead, a general would have aides de camp that were attached to him. So young officers that were highly literate that would be responsible for translating the general's ideas into action. So there were probably about 10 of these for Washington. And what they would do is talk to him and then write out military orders to be given to subordinates. Hamilton was especially trusted. He spoke fluent French from his French background in the Caribbean. So he was a good liaison with other officers, French officers like the Marquis de Lafayette. He was put in charge of most of the Army intelligence, so coordinating a network of hundreds of spies. Washington could trust him to write cogent letters to the states, to Congress, to other generals. He became very much Washington's right-hand man, whether that was at Valley Forge or elsewhere. Whoops. Excuse me. So I think Valley Forge is fairly famous as a disastrous winter encampment. In the winter of 1779 to 1780, Washington's army had a different winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey. And this is where Hamilton made the next step in his career and sort of climbing that status ladder, and that was to find a wife of high status. So the story, it's an apocryphal story. It's not a true story, but it's one that biographers have repeated for a very, very long time. And that is that Martha Washington organized a series of balls and dances to introduce young ladies from high-ranking families to young officers in Washington's army, and that also at that time there was a feral tomcat that was walking around the camp that Martha adopted, and this tomcat would constantly be seeking after other, female felines, right? So Martha named the tomcat Hamilton because that was what Hamilton was doing at these balls, right? Trying to find a wife and not being too discriminate about it. Probably the reason that this apocryphal story has been repeated so much is that it does capture a little bit of Hamilton's ambition. He made sure that he was going to find someone of very high status to marry. This was not just going to be a marriage only of love, but something that was really going to move his career forward. And ultimately, he found a number of daughters from General Philip Schuyler, who had married into one of the wealthiest families in America, the Van Rensselaers, who had lots of land in upstate New York. Hamilton was close with 3 of those daughters. Schuyler had many children, 15 children, but 3 of them Hamilton was very close with. And within a year, he had married one of them, Eliza. Now, having done this, he really wanted to put, to cap his career, his military career, with a final command in the field to show his personal bravery, going back to this idea of using the military experience to gain glory. And for months, Hamilton demanded that Washington allow him to no longer be an aide de camp and to give him a field position. Washington was not comfortable with this because he relied on Hamilton so much. He began to, give promotions to other people. Hamilton got very upset, and they had a falling out. And Hamilton resigned his staff position, which essentially forced Washington's hand. And Hamilton was given 3 battalions of infantry that he was then able to command at Yorktown. And probably the most important battle at the siege of Yorktown was when Hamilton ordered and directly led the attack on Redoubt Number 10, which was a nighttime bayonet charge on a fortified position. And after that was successful, essentially British hostility ceased. So that was the end of the last major battle of the American Revolution, and really something that Hamilton could hang his hat on. He no longer saw there being much point in staying in the military as essentially mop-up operations were continuing. He resigned his commission and then left and went to New York to study law and become a lawyer. He recognized that there really were not good law books. He wrote one, and then in the process of making that book, he had effectively studied for the bar and very quickly passed the bar. So again, showing his prodigious work effort and ambition, work ethic and ambition. So at this point, the war is essentially over, and the major takeaway that Hamilton had from the war was that Congress was ineffective. He was with Washington and the Continental Army throughout the war, and basically saw that the men were poorly clothed, poorly armed, and that Congress, even though it had been told to come up with money to fund the war effort, there was no mechanism under the Articles of Confederation to force states to do so. The states were sovereign. The United States was a plural. There was no single country. Congress was sort of like a UN. You had delegates from different countries. And basically Hamilton saw this as disgusting. It was something that had left soldiers in the lurch. So after the war, he becomes a congressman, and basically tries to do something about this. It's impossible. There's the ability for small states like Rhode Island to gum up the works and to prevent any collective action from taking place. And during this time that Hamilton's a congressman, you have the Newburgh Conspiracy. So basically the idea there was that officers were trying to lead what may have been a coup, basically just trying to get their pay, trying to get their back pay, trying to get their pensions from Congress, and thinking about marching on Congress in order to effect this. Hamilton encouraged Washington to lead that group of disgruntled officers. Washington, in fact, dismissed that advice, went the other direction, and was able to peacefully dispel this movement, so that there was no invasion of Congress or any kind of sedition against Congress. There were a couple more actions, and basically Hamilton felt that he couldn't do anything to make the country really work as it should, as a single unitary country, and he ends up resigning from Congress and then focusing on going back to New York and trying to make money. So during that time, he worked as a lawyer, often defending either British subjects or loyalists and their property, and the property that they had lost during the war, trying to get that back. In addition, he helped found the Bank of New York, helped turn King's College into Columbia, what's now Columbia University, but politics kept calling him back. So if he had really just focused on making money, he certainly could have. He was a talented person, but in the end, he was trying to fix the country. So the first instance of this was the Annapolis Convention, where you had a number of delegates that were trying to fix interstate commerce. And then the famous instance of this was the Constitutional Convention. So basically, the idea was that at the Annapolis Convention, the delegates were able to convince Congress that the Articles of Confederation themselves needed to be amended so that the financial issues between states could be worked out. And instead, at the Constitutional Convention, you had what amounted to essentially a coup. Instead of amending the Articles of Confederation were essentially tossed out, and an entirely new constitution was created. Now, Hamilton was not the most influential figure at that Constitutional Convention. Instead, that was definitely James Madison. Madison had what was called the Virginia Plan, and that's very similar to what we have today as our constitutional model. But Hamilton's idea was to get up and speak about moving to an English model. So essentially a mirror of the English monarchy. So he said, get rid of the states, elect senators for life, have an indirect election, so electors, an electoral college that would elect essentially a king. He called it a governor, but this would be a very powerful executive with absolute veto power over the legislators. And what happened was that no one at the Constitutional Convention thought any of this was a good idea, that you cannot go back to monarchy once you've had a revolution against it. But it may have been that Hamilton was, in fact, just proposing this to make the Virginia Plan look more reasonable. So it's really not clear. Certainly at times he was branded as a monarchist, and certainly he was very happy with the Virginia Plan in the aftermath of the convention. But in any event, he sort of proposed this arguably far right alternative to really make a powerful central executive that ultimately helped get the Constitution that we currently have in place. Now, once the Constitutional Convention was over, Hamilton was a huge figure in getting that Constitution passed, especially as a pamphleteer again for the Federalist Papers. He ended up writing about 2/3 of the Federalist Papers. These were a series of arguments that argued why the states should allow for this new Constitution to change the format of government so that instead of having the United States be a series of different countries, that the United States would instead be a singular unitary country with somewhat sovereign states underneath. So in the aftermath of that new Constitution getting passed, George Washington became the first president, and Hamilton effectively functioned as his prime minister. He was the major policy figure as Secretary of the Treasury. So the most important thing that was happening in the country at that time, in Hamilton's view, was what was going on with money. If the country could not sort out its financial issues, then when the country got involved in a war with a great power the next time, it would not be able to effectively fight. And he knew this very well from his own personal experience in Washington's army. So Hamilton developed a plan. So at that time, the United States had a very large debt, a large collective debt, $54 million. The states had individual debts of about half that size. Some of the states were doing a good job of paying that off. Most were not. And what Hamilton wanted to do was to change the idea about how you look at that debt. That debt should instead be seen as something that could establish credit for the United States. If the United States did a good job of paying that debt off, it would show future investors that the United States was a good credit risk. And then in the event of the next war, the US could then raise money if need be. So the idea was, okay, first you have to assume the state debts so that there would be one single debt that the federal government would be able to pay off. Second, you have a Bank of the United States that's modeled on the Bank of England. So it's not exactly a national bank. It's a private bank, but the elites of the country are going to be tied into that bank. And then the United States' funds are going to be placed into that bank to give the finances a strong grounding. And then on top of that, you have to figure out a way to actually generate revenue. So the main thing that would be done is customs, but also excise taxes could be raised. So the problem with this is that traditionally customs could be avoided. Merchants could smuggle, and it was very difficult for the British to collect customs taxes. Hamilton had some innovations there because he was very familiar with smuggling in the Caribbean. So some of these things are creating lighthouses, creating a cutter fleet of small ships that could move around and target smugglers. So he was able to effectively create a customs force that was much better at collecting customs duties. But he also wanted to push for excise taxes, essentially the very thing that Americans had gone into a revolution about in the first place. So that was the prongs of the plan. Assume the state debts, have the Bank of the United States as this firm financial grounding, and then raise some revenue. The big problem for many was, how are you going to assume these debts? So, for example, people that had bought war bonds when the war bonds were relatively expensive felt defrauded by the end of the war if inflation had moved such that the bonds were worth almost nothing. And then you had a series of wealthy speculators, for example, John Adams's wife, Abigail, would buy up these bonds for pennies on the dollar. And then the question is, if the federal government pays these back, at full face value, these speculators would then make a lot of money, but they had not been the ones to sacrifice early on for the war effort. In any event, Hamilton was adamant that if you want credit for the future, you can't worry about the justice of whether or not speculators are going to benefit in the present. So he really wanted to push this issue of assumption of debts and paying off debts at full face value in order to have a strong fiscal state in the future. This was the main issue that people could not agree upon. Ultimately, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton agreed that Hamilton could go ahead with this plan in the event that they moved the capital to the South. And that's why you have the Compromise of 1790 moving the capital to what's now Washington, D.C., very close to Washington's private lands. Now, arguably the most important event in Hamilton's life was the Whiskey Rebellion. And that was directly related to his effort to raise money through excise taxes. So the idea was that one of the ways you could raise money was through taxing distilled spirits. You could either do it through a flat tax or a per gallon tax. And the idea is that if you could just charge a small flat tax, then you would encourage manufacturing. Massive manufacturers of whiskey would not really have to pay very much. But certainly no one would pay that rather moderate or large flat tax if instead they could pay a per gallon rate if you were a small distiller. The basic problem was that there was a trade imbalance between the east and west of the country. The Appalachian region of the country relied on whiskey as a medium of exchange. They didn't have cash. So whiskey was something that could be traded around and essentially replace or be used as replacement money. So essentially in Appalachia, the whiskey tax was a direct income tax, and it was a fairly significant per gallon tax. Whereas in the East, you had very large distillers that could make money off of selling whiskey and pay relatively modest taxes. In fact, the largest distiller of whiskey in the country was George Washington. That was what he was doing on a lot of his farms. So as a result of this seeming injustice, people did what they had done in the 1760s, 1770s. There were a series of tax riots. And Hamilton basically convinced Washington to federalize a large number of militia. So an army of 13,000 men, larger basically than any American Revolutionary Army, and to move out with Hamilton, leaving his post at the Secretary of the Treasury and moving out into the field with Washington. And they essentially smashed a fly with a sledgehammer. There was no fighting. The army was so large that they put down the tax rebellion without there being any bloodshed. However, at that point, there was a lot of criticism for Hamilton, having created a tyrannical central government. His wife suffered a miscarriage, and he had essentially gotten most of his program passed through. He decided to resign his position as Secretary of the Treasury. Now, the main thing to understand here is that he also, by being in that presidential post in the cabinet, was developing a rivalry with Jefferson that was against the values of the founding fathers. So the founding fathers did not want parties to take place in the new country. They wanted the best men to self-sacrifice and to run the country not based on party ideology or party affinity, but instead on what they personally thought was best and the best way to run things. Instead, what you have is two very different visions of the country developing. So essentially, you had Jeffersonians that wanted an agricultural country that saw independent farmers as being the key to having an effective democracy that was not corrupted by money. And then on the other hand, you have Hamiltonians that wanted the country to be an effective warfighting force. So they needed the country to develop manufacturing, to have financial interests in cities, and so on. So essentially an idealistic versus realistic perspective was developing. So on the one hand, the Hamiltonians became the party of the Federalists. On the other, the Jeffersonians became the party of the Democratic Republicans, which was the forerunner of the modern Democrat Party. So those two parties really clashed over a whole series of events, whether or not to support tariffs, how are you going to take taxes, and should you, smash the Whiskey Rebellion, for example, should you back the French or the British in the French Revolution, et cetera. So even during the Washington administration, Hamilton and Jefferson were pulling strings behind the scenes with the media, fighting ideological battles in the press. Hamilton's paper was the Gazette of the United States. Jefferson's was the National Gazette. After leaving the cabinet, Hamilton founded his own paper, which still exists, the New York Evening Post. And basically, by the end of Washington's administration, even though no one agreed that this was a good thing, you had full-blown political parties that were rivaling one another. As a result of that, even after Hamilton left the administration and really should have been focusing on his personal law career, he really couldn't pull himself away from politics. He tried to get involved in essentially Federalist Party politics. He tried to make sure that Pinckney was going to be president after Washington and not Adams. He did not trust John Adams' character. That did not go well, and really made a permanent rift between him and Adams. In the Adams administration, there was almost a war with France, and Hamilton is sort of brought out of retirement, more or less, to lead this army that would have fought the French had there been an invasion. Again, Hamilton demands more taxes, and in kind of a repeat of the Whiskey Rebellion, you have another tax protest that ends up being known as Fry's Rebellion in Pennsylvania. And essentially, Adams is able to shut down this war with France, and Hamilton is sent back home. And then once again, in the election of 1800, Hamilton privately campaigns against Adams. The Jeffersonians find out about this private campaign and publicize it, and this really harms Hamilton's reputation among pretty much everyone in the country. Now, in that election, because you don't have parties, technically, everyone competes for the same votes. So you have a number of people that are running. The first vote getter is going to become the president. The second vote getter is going to become the vice president, et cetera. But because you have Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians that both want both the presidency and the vice presidency, what ends up happening is that Jefferson's party gets the same number of electoral college votes for both Jefferson and Aaron Burr. This then goes to the House, and it's ultimately Hamilton that decides that Aaron Burr is not to be trusted, and instead backs Jefferson for the presidency, so that Hamilton's vote is decisive, or Hamilton's influence is decisive in having Jefferson be president, his main rival, but someone whose character he trusts, unlike the character of Aaron Burr. So that decision ultimately probably led to Hamilton's death in a duel with Aaron Burr. But before I get to that, I want to talk briefly about Hamilton's personal character and the allegation that he had a number of affairs. First of all, there have been, I suppose, a small number of biographers that have thought that it's possible that Hamilton had homosexual affairs with other men in the army, including Lawrence and Lafayette. While that's possible, it's probably a misreading of the letters that we have. So at the time, educated people were very interested in demonstrating how educated they were. There was a whole culture of what was called belles lettres. So that's written in French, right? Beautiful letters. And the idea was that you were going to demonstrate how flowery that you can write your affection for your friends and so on. So a good example of this is Major John Andre was a British spy that ended up being executed by the Americans. And essentially Hamilton really was upset by this decision to execute Andre because he was such a good writer. Because he was so elegant, because he was someone that could, make art well. These were things that would trump, his political failings of having been a spy among the Americans. So it's likely that it's the same kind of thing going on, right? That yes, he's sending these beautiful letters back and forth to Lafayette, but that's more about homosociality, friendship, than it is about homosexuality. The other allegation is that he had an affair with his wife's older sister, Angelica. Some biographers are very certain of this, others not so much. So basically, there's not much evidence other than these beautiful letters that he was writing to a number of people, and also that he spent a ton of his personal money moving her to New York at one part of her marriage. and ultimately the father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, had to get involved and send her back to her husband. Is that conclusive evidence that Hamilton and Angelica were having an affair? It maybe doesn't rule it out, doesn't necessarily prove it either. The affair that probably happened, almost certainly happened, was the affair with Maria Reynolds. So what happened was, while Hamilton was Treasury Secretary, the official kind of story is that Reynolds was married to James Reynolds, who was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and came to Hamilton for help, that she was not being supported by her husband. He agreed to help her financially. This kind of turned into a romance. Once James Reynolds figured out that this was a sexual affair between Hamilton and Maria, he then blackmailed Hamilton for a very large amount of his yearly earnings, something like a third of his income, and then was investigated because it appeared to be that he was embezzling funds that were supposed to be going to veterans. So again, this is a time of high inflation. It's a time when there's a lot of a lack of clarity about who's paying whom in terms of army pensions, et cetera. So basically, you have an investigation by the Jeffersonians. They uncover this, and Reynolds is accusing Hamilton of paying this blackmail money. And basically, Hamilton is forced to write a long pamphlet, something like a 100-page pamphlet, defending himself, saying that he is not involved in embezzling funds that were meant for soldiers, but instead was just involved in this sexual affair and had to pay hush money to keep it private. And essentially that ends his hopes of being a major national figure, a presidential candidate, et cetera. It is possible that this is not true. In other words, there is an alternative reading of all of this. So, for example, the original letters, the love letters that were supposed to exist between Maria and Hamilton, that Hamilton kind of recreates in his pamphlet, those original letters do not exist. So the handwriting on those letters cannot be found or checked. His wife, Eliza Schuyler, was so upset after the affair was exposed that she burned all of the love letters between herself and Alexander and left and went to live with her parents for a while. That would, the interpretation here is that that's a convenience, because in fact what Hamilton had done is gone back through his love letters with Eliza and basically transcribed them and said they were from Maria Reynolds, in order to cover up the fact that there was never an affair, and that they were in fact embezzling money from veterans. So, Occam's razor would suggest that that probably Alexander had an affair with Maria Reynolds. That seems like a less complicated story. However, Maria Reynolds herself and also James Monroe, the Jeffersonian politician that was looking into this, were fairly open that said this is really a cover-up. So it's not entirely clear. The other affair or series of affairs that Hamilton really was affected by in his life were affairs of honor. So at the time, elite men were often engaged in duels with one another. Duels were certainly illegal. If you murdered someone in a duel, technically that was no different than any other kind of murder. Often the case was that juries would acquit. It's not really clear how many duels or near duels Hamilton was involved in. It's something like half a dozen or a dozen. Basically, they did not get all the way to the stage of people firing at one another. He was also engaged in a number of duels as a second, right? So that he was, supporting other people's dueling. As his career went on and he became, increasingly abrasive and the political situation devolved, basically, two duels destroyed his family. The first was when Philip essentially defended his honor against a Jeffersonian political opponent. and died in a duel in 1801. This didn't just kill Philip; it also essentially ruined the mental health of many people in the rest of the family, especially Angelica, is one of his daughters. And then after that, in 1804, he had the famous duel with Burr. That was again just about accusations of Burr not having personal integrity as a result of an election, a New York governor's election. So in terms of the details of that duel with Burr, there are many stories back and forth, and I think at this point it's really impossible to know what Hamilton's attitude was. Probably he was trying to delope. In other words, to not fire at Burr and just fire up in the air in order to, have both men's honor be preserved. It's not really possible to know whether he fired first and Burr thought that he had been fired at, or whether Burr fired first and then as a result, Hamilton sort of involuntarily shot above Burr's head. But in any event, Hamilton did die as a result of his duel with Burr. And really could have had a much longer impact on American politics had that not occurred. So in terms of his family legacy, he had 8 children with Eliza, and of course Philip did not survive. But Hamilton died after his own son. In fact, he had 2 sons named Philip because the next son born afterward took the dead Philip's name. Eliza continued to live another 50 years after Hamilton died. Even though there was apparently a series of betrayals here, Eliza was completely devoted to Alexander's memory. She kept a sonnet that he had written her when they were young around her neck for the rest of her life. She organized his papers. She kept searching for a biographer and ultimately had her son write a very positive biography of Hamilton. And she was extensively active in the New York charity scene, focusing on orphans, which of course Hamilton was one as a young man. In terms of his political legacy, I think the important thing to understand is that prior to Hamilton really getting involved in politics, you had, the United States as a plural. And because of the efforts of Hamilton and others, the United States became a single country, a unitary United States, with a powerful executive, a very powerful central bank, and essentially an urban vision. And in addition to that very powerful fiscal military state, Hamilton set off this idea of party politics. So whether he intended it or not, the modern United States is very much a result of the vision that Hamilton put forward, a very long time ago. So, essentially that legacy lives on to this day. Okay, so that's what I've got, and I'm happy to stop sharing the PowerPoint there and go ahead and answer questions if anyone has them.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Marcus, for sharing that. And again, if anyone who has questions, please use the chat feature, and I'll go ahead and ask them. First off, Marcus, that was truly wonderful. I know personally I learned a ton. And I have a couple of questions that I thought of when you shared your presentation with me a little earlier. And I was really struck that you really went into talking about the Whiskey Rebellion as a major inflection point on Alexander Hamilton, especially because if anyone's seen the musical, it's basically just a throwaway line in, I think, Cabinet Battle #1. Jefferson says, I'm going to do this really badly. Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's going to happen when they try to tax our whiskey. You shared how much that was an impactful aspect for Hamilton. What do you think the lasting effects are of the whiskey? What are the lasting effects of the Whiskey Rebellion? Because we really don't hear about it very much today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of them. So for one, I think arguably the the immediate effect would be for many people in the Appalachians to have an extreme distrust of the central government. And you could probably trace that even all the way to the present, this distaste for the central government in a lot of Appalachia. In addition to that, I think I already talked a little bit about how really that was seen as way over the top aggressive tyranny, and helped build the opposition to the Federalist Party. So helped form the Democratic Republicans, so the forerunners of the modern Democrat Party. And I guess the other thing, the thing to look at from Hamilton's point of view is that, essentially, if you have a republic, not everyone is going to agree with every law. So what do you do about that? And that's it's not something that you really have any precedence for prior to the Washington administration. And there are a series of crises that try to answer that question over time. So, in the Adams administration, you've got the Virginia and Kentucky resolution. So states are saying, look, we're going to nullify this national law that we don't like. You see that again with the nullification crisis in the Jackson administration. You essentially see it again with the secession crisis in the Lincoln administration, leading to the Civil War. So the Whiskey Rebellion is an early indication that, if you don't like the way that laws are going, tough, right? The presidency is going to enforce the laws as they are, and the country has got to stick with them until the next election. And I think that was really the attitude that Hamilton had. If you don't like the laws, we have a republic for a reason. So that's what I would say about the Whiskey Rebellion. I think it was a really important event that doesn't make Hamilton look very good. So it's reasonable for it not to be a big part of the musical.
Yeah, it makes sense. In reality, we don't hear about it in American history all that much anyway, whether it's in the musical or not. It's just not something we hear all that much about. Doug mentioned something that was actually very similar to my next question. It's really interesting that he, was the one of the main, people who helped found our current modern American state, but he also helped, establish the modern American political divide. What do you think Hamilton would say about that divide? Would he be happy with it? Especially where we are in a really fractured nation right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would definitely immediately recognize, okay, well, you've got partisan media. You've got very personal attacks between politicians. These are things that were certainly going on in his lifetime. He wouldn't bat an eye, right? This is expected. In terms of things that would horrify him, probably the amount of money that is influencing the political process would be something entirely shocking. Hamilton was not exactly a big government politician. He was sort of an efficient government politician. The founding fathers could not have possibly imagined, the growth of bureaucracy, the growth of wealth and money in the country at the time. I think, in some ways he would look at the country and say, it's wonderful that America has become the great power that he envisioned. In other ways, I think he would be very upset at the extent to which people were corrupted by money. Consistently in his career, he's kind of got opportunities to be corrupted by money, and he does a terrible job at making money, right? He's very interested in the politics instead. Thank
you for that. Next question, and we're getting some really great ones, a lot of wonderful feedback. Someone mentioned with your backdrop, Hamilton will be more enjoyable to attend in January at Playhouse Square. So again, thank you. Another question was, do you think we might find any other founding fathers will be as interesting as Hamilton, or did Lin-Manuel Miranda do a great job to conflate how interesting Hamilton actually was?
Yeah, I don't know. That's going to be personal preference. I probably no one is more personally conflicted than Jefferson and his personal legacy of slavery, but also having children with one of his slaves. it's hard to say. I mean, I think that in general, that founding era is getting further and further away from popular history, things that people are aware of. So I'm really slowly in the process of writing a biography of George Croghan. I think this is someone that is absolutely completely forgotten, and in our current era. I would argue that he is a really fascinating figure, but whenever I actually publish this thing, then people can check it out and see if they agree.
Well, that sounds like another topic that we should do a program on at some point. Inform our alums about your research. So, I guess a follow-up question to that one. Do you think Hamilton, knowing how much Hamilton was all about his legacy, right? Like he wanted to rise above the station. Do you think he'd be happy with knowing that his name is like, it's out there, it's everywhere because of this musical?
Yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, almost all of the figures from this era imagined themselves in this way at all times. So in many ways, this was the first generation of Americans that were really exposed to money, exposed to education. They were all fascinated with ancient history. Many of them saw themselves, especially as a Brutus, right? Somebody that was the protector of a republic. And they crafted public faces, basically public masks, in order to project, okay, here's how I want to be remembered. You see this with Adams and Jefferson sending letters to one another. They're really, really intent on, crafting a public persona, or Jefferson, making his own tombstone, right? And here are the things that you need to remember about me, right? So yeah, absolutely. I think Hamilton would be very, very pleased that that people are still talking about him, but also not surprised. He knew how important he was, and all of these people were convinced of their absolute world historical importance, right, in terms of setting up this republic at this time.
And let's finish with this last question. It goes back to another line in the musical about the relationship between Hamilton and Lafayette. There's a line in the musical where it says, "Immigrants, we get the job done." Did they have a close relationship? In I know there's another part of that musical where they're talking Hamilton just says the French will figure out their own revolution. And Jefferson chastises him for not supporting Lafayette. Can you square that circle a little bit?
Yeah. So they did have a close relationship. They were tight. Part of that was that Hamilton was probably the person around the army that spoke the best French. His French was excellent from growing up with his mother. In addition to that, I guess in order to talk about the French Revolution stuff, Hamilton was a big supporter of the French Revolution initially. And that was generally the case across Americans. They saw the French Revolution as a sister revolution to the American Revolution. It was only once the French Revolution turned into the Terror that Hamilton began to worry about the direction that French Revolution was going. It was turning against religion. It was turning towards radical mob politics. And Hamilton was firmly of the idea that you have to have what people call natural aristocrats running things, right? That you find the best people, people recognize who their betters are, they allow them to make decisions, because once you get into the situation where mobs are making decisions, once you have a real democracy, then you don't know what's going to happen, and you can very quickly devolve into chaos, and ultimately chaos is going to threaten people's property, their lives, the fundamental Enlightenment values that people like Hamilton had. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I rambled a little bit there, but I hope I answered that question.
No, I think you did, because I think it actually, and if I remember correctly, he in the musical, I think they actually reference the violence of, beheading the king, and the king supported the Americans during the revolution. The king's not there anymore. So I think they mentioned that a little bit. Would you mind doing one last question? Because it's not specific to the topic of Alexander Hamilton. Do you mind one last question?
Sure.
All right. So we always think about Hamilton. The other side of that coin is Burr. Do you think he has been vilified because of Hamilton's legacy? Is it unfair? Is it justified? I mean, he comes across as a pretty big villain in the musical. What are your thoughts on Burr?
Yeah, I would have to go back and really sort of list all of Burr's villainous accomplishments. But I think of if anyone is going to be stained as a villain from that era, Burr's a pretty good candidate. He was somebody that was really pretty self-interested, and his loyalty to the country was fairly tenuous. Obviously a talented person, but not very trustworthy according to his contemporaries. So I think that Burr's not someone I've studied extensively. He's a very, very colorful character, but yeah, probably deserved.
Fair enough. And I'll just say one of our alums, General Carter Ham, who served in the U.S. Army, shared a little bit a piece of knowledge that I don't know if you know, but I surely didn't. Hamilton's legacy lives on in the U.S. Army today. The 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery carries the title Hamilton's Own, referring to Marcus's comment on the first slide about Hamilton's early role as a military leader, and traces its lineage to the unit Hamilton led in the Revolution. So thank you, General Ham, for sharing that.
Very cool. No, I didn't know that.
So, well, Marcus, thank you again so much for taking time out of your evening tonight. This was truly wonderful. I am so glad that you were able to share your expertise with all of us. And John Carroll truly is fortunate to have you within our community, teaching our students every day and helping them better understand our nation's history. So thank you again for being with us this evening.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate it.
And finally, before I let you go, please consider if a charitable gift this holiday season in support of our students, our outstanding faculty like Dr. Gallo, and our entire campus community. If you already made the gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please join me in supporting John Carroll. You can make a gift at jcu.edu/give. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, be well, have a wonderful holiday season, and onward on, John Carroll.